Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom. This is Torah study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning, as always, by my dear friends, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch of the American Jewish University and Rabbi Mark Gelman of Florida. And we're delighted to have you here to celebrate Shabbos. It's Shabbos, it's Rosh Chodesh, and it's Hanukkah. So for those of us who can make it to synagogue despite the COVID pandemic, this would be a Shabbos when we would take out 3 Sifrei Torah from the Ark and have a very long service. So we wish you,
Eddie, is this called a triple threat Shabbos?
a triple threat Shabbos, and an awful lot for rabbis to talk about. This morning, we're going to begin the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph coincides with the Hanukkah story, and that's simply a quirk of the calendar, although there have been many midrashim that try to find connections between Joseph and his history and the Hanukkah story. And the story is a remarkable story. It is the denouement, it is the sort of climax of the book of Genesis. As we've said before in previous episodes, the book of Genesis is organized around a series of brother stories. The Torah's notion is that human development and human history are driven by the relationship among brothers. So Cain and Abel, their rivalry, the rivalry between the sons of Noah, the rivalry between Abraham and his brother, who's represented by Lot, his brother's son, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. And now we come to the children of Jacob, and Jacob's 12 children, 13 children, including Dinah. They have this, the rivalry becomes worse than ever. If nothing else, because there's no mother here to protect the weaker sons. Rachel, having died and giving birth to Benjamin, leaves Joseph on his own. And the story begins with the introduction of this terrible, terrible rivalry. I want to go back for just a second before we jump into the rivalry to see where it comes from, because I think it's quite remarkable. So I want to jump back just for a moment in the Torah and see the end of the beginning of the family, okay? It begins after the wedding scene, the famous, red wedding of the Bible, in which Leah is replaced in the place of Rachel. And then when Rachel becomes part of the family, now Jacob finds himself with not one, not two, not three, but 4 different wives, as it were. And here's how the story begins. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved. That is an amazing statement. I mean, this woman is completely cast into this family without anything, without any of the protections of love or appreciation. And he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben. Each of the names has a name, for she declared, it means the Lord has seen my affliction. It also means now my husband will love me. From the word ro'ez, see, now my husband will see me. Now he'll see me. And then she conceives again, and the next one is named Shimon. And Shimon means that now he'll hear me. God has heard me, and now my husband will hear me too. And the next one is Levi, which means now my husband will accompany me. And finally, she gives birth to Yehudah, and she gives up the names having to do with the husband, and he's the most self-possessed of all of the characters. Now, that rivalry, that neediness, the neediness of Leah is carried into the family. The neediness of Leah is carried into the family, and the sense in which she is eclipsed by Rachel and her children. That becomes the basis for the next generation, because Joseph is, after all, Rachel's child. And now that Rachel has died, giving birth to his younger brother, Benjamin, Joseph is all that Jacob has left of his beloved wife, Rachel, and he longs for her. And so Joseph becomes the favorite. Joseph becomes the favorite, and the whole family, and the whole family knows it, and Joseph dotes on him. There's the coat of pasim, the coat of stripes, or the coat of colors that he's wrapped in. And then there's these dreams, these remarkably egocentric dreams where the whole world comes and bows down to me, says Joseph. And Joseph can't help but tell everybody these dreams. And he inflames his brothers, and he antagonizes even the father until everyone hates him. And then he's sent out to go to be with the brothers. Now, we'll get into this story. It is such a fascinating narrative. The question I want to ask is why this narrative is here. What is the burden of this narrative? What is this narrative there to teach us? And I want to make the suggestion with my dear colleagues here. I want to make the suggestion that what we're being shown beyond simply the narrative of brothers at each other's throats is a picture of the way history works. It's a picture of the way the world is. Because one of the questions that the story is going to raise with us is, where is God in all of this? Where is the God who sent Abraham from Mesopotamia to Canaan? Where is the God who's talking to Isaac and Rebekah? Where is the God who's blessing Jacob? Where is God in all of this story? And the story has these wonderful curlicues and ups and downs. And the question is, where is God in this story? Rabbi Gelman, where is God in this story?
It's the Deus absconditus, the God who is not evident in the workings of history. And this is why the Joseph story is in many ways the most important one in the Torah. It's the largest narrative in Genesis, and it's the most important because it's the most similar to the way we have had to live in our relationship with God in the diaspora. And that is with a God who does not speak to us. And that means that we have to find our way to God without the kind of hello there, 2x4 upside the face, smack in the face statements by God, hello, here I am, or Avraham, Hineni, I'm here. So without that kind of direct presence of God as an actor, just in the literary drama, we have in Joseph a story where God never speaks to Joseph. And so all of a sudden, we have a story that looks like our own Jewish life. And it's a story also that's similar to our lives in the diaspora, in that it's a story of political powerlessness. It's a way of making the case that the only way that we will survive, to take the Zechariah Haftorah for Hanukkah, lo b'chayil lo b'choach b'im b'ruchi, not by might and not by power, but by my spirit. Now, Israel represents a completely different option, just as the book of Exodus represents a different option in our relationship with God when we come to that. But I like the Joseph story more than I like the Exodus story, because there's nothing in Exodus that's resonant with my life or our history in the diaspora of God leading us and causing plagues and the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire. You don't have to have any faith. It's not a story of faith, Exodus. It's a story of power. You follow whoever has the most power. If it's Pharaoh, you follow Pharaoh. If it's God, you follow God. But Joseph is about, who do you follow when there is no voice? And how do you secure your family and your future without political power? And the answer to that is through manipulation, through using our intelligence and our best efforts to gain power, ascribed power from those who have it. That's why I think the Joseph story is our story.
So you're proposing then two different models of the question of, does God have a role in our history?
Joseph and Moses, right?
Joseph and Moses. The Moses story is God who is an overt actor in our history.
Yeah.
Bushes burn, frogs rain down from the sky, and rivers turned into blood. And then you have this other model in which God is, as you said, abscondus. It's behind the scenes. God is somehow, behind the scenes and very difficult, obscured by the history. And it's difficult to find out exactly what the divine will is. And that's the great challenge of interpreting history under these circumstances. Got that right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And just one more word about that. The Moses model is impossible, because if it is the model that we use, then the moment that we experience a political defeat, it's a defeat for God. The moment that something bad happens, we ask, where's God? And I call this the Superman problem. I love comic books, I love Superman, but when I was a kid, the basic problem with the Ubermensch, with the Superman, is that all the people who are in the presence of this extraordinary power, either God or Moses, they're really, the difference isn't that great. They just sit back and they say, look, what are we supposed to do? We'll follow whatever you say. But without that, you have to become Joseph. You have to use your wits. You have to plan. You have to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. And you have to be wise about how you survive without power. That is our genius, to survive without political power until the Holocaust refutes that view and Israel represents a whole other option down the road. But for 2,000 years, this was our way.
Well, but it does.
Joseph
I want to interrupt you for a moment,
Yeah, no,
because
that's fine, I'm done.
after the 1967 war, there's a political movement that rises in Israel, which wants to see Israel as an expression, they want to go
Yeah.
back to the Moses model. They want to see Israel as a direct expression of divine will. That we add to the Birkat Hamazon, Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, the
Yeah.
beginning of the flowering of redemption. And I've had conversations with people living in caravans, living in trailers on the West Bank, where without any compunctions or without any hesitations, this is God's will. It's God's will that we take this property. It's God's will that we hold this territory. It's God's will that this is Jewish territory, and nothing compromises that. Nothing compromises that conviction. So it hasn't gone away. Modernity has not extinguished that kind of faith or that kind of image of what history could be. Sherry, talk to me about what else you find in this story, because there's more to it. Go ahead, please.
There is more to it. And before you say anything, before I say a word, I want to say, Mark, I loved comic books, and especially Wonder Woman, because my brother was obsessed. So I can't wait till the new Marvel Wonder Woman movie comes out.
Yeah.
That being said, I have a different take, which is that God is very active, very involved in Moses' life, because we're going to make the paradigm Moses and Joseph, and doesn't talk to Joseph at all. I think the Bible is narrating for us the mercurial nature of God, that sometimes God is going to be very much with us and may even speak to us. How you understand speaking or hearing God's voice may be different for you, but don't rely on that. Don't think that that's the God and it's done, it's set. And I think it's telling us about humanity, right? If we're made in God's image, we can't rely on the fact that people are going to be one way and they're always going to be like that, and that's the end of it. It's that there's many facets to human beings, and that they're going to change and surprise us and speak to us in different ways. And we have to be able to tolerate the discomfort of all those different interactions, because the minute we think someone is complete and done, we are not seeing them in their totality. So I think it's much more about the mercurial nature of God and the mercurial nature of humanity.
How about let me just propose a slight interpretive change. Instead of the mercurial nature, how about a world of open possibilities? A world of opportunities, a world of openness without, please.
So humans aren't so reliant upon God? Is that what you mean by open possibilities?
Yeah, or that there isn't a power deciding how the story is going to end. The story has many open possibilities. History has many open possibilities.
I like it because it's a more positive spin.
Yeah, it's Hanukkah. I'm trying to be generous here.
Yeah, of course.
Well, let me just say one word. The fact is that if we take the Moses model, it destroys the only thing that's unique about us as human beings, the fundamental reason we're made in the image of God, and that is freedom of the will. Our ability to choose and decide what to do is our unique nature. But if we're in the face of overwhelming power and plagues and pillars of fire and smoke and a burning mountain, there's no freedom of will. That the rabbis understood that in their own way when they said what God asked us if we would accept the Torah by holding Mount Sinai over us and asking, well, will you accept it or should I drop the mountain on you?
Mark,
There's no freedom of will there. But in Joseph, it's all will. It's all his decision about how to survive and how to find God in his survival and how to find his brothers in his survival. And I think it's on a literary level, God's understanding that God got off on a really, maybe it was necessary, but it was a bad footing by becoming too big an actor in the biblical drama. And eventually, not in Exodus, but eventually at the end of the Tanakh, that's over. And God is forever and ever no longer in the historical frame. And it's up to us to find God.
Go ahead, Chair, please.
raising my hand. So are you saying, Mark, I just want to clarify this, that God's retraction from interacting with us, humanity, is the greatest gift God gave us?
Without a doubt, because without it, we can't exercise our freedom of the will. We're like children. That's exactly why we don't call the leaving of the Garden of Eden the fall, as Christians do, the fall of man. We never say that. And the reason is that it's by being expelled from Eden, by eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that we achieve our true humanity. And God tried to have a world in which we were like bees in a hive or ants in an anthill, and we had no freedom of the will, and God directed everything. But that world makes it impossible for us to have freedom of the will. And let me say that with a more powerful point, and that is not freedom of the will, but love. You cannot love unless you have free will. You can't love unless you freely offer that love, which God did to us. But we can't offer that love back if we're just a bunch of people following fire. We have to offer that love without evidence, without empirical evidence, because empirical evidence isn't faith. I look and I see there's a glass on my desk. That's not faith, that's evidence. I have sensory evidence, empirical evidence. And faith requires evidence that does not come from the senses, but comes from the soul and the heart and from inferring what we see in the world. So that's what I mean, that our freedom is essential and God's presence blots out our freedom. That's what I mean.
I'm going to take a different tack. I think it's significant that these are stories, that this is narrative and not discursive philosophy. You see, if it's discursive philosophy, then Rabbi Gelman is certainly right. If you place before us the proposition of a God who is an all-powerful actor in history, that extinguishes any possibility for human moral freedom, right? But if you take it as narrative, I think you're being asked a different question, which is, under what circumstances is this narrative useful? Who tells such stories? When you're talking to an oppressed people, and whether that oppressed people is Jews who were living in an unbearable exile, an unbearable galut in the Middle Ages, or whether you're talking to Africans, African Americans who have been brought to this country as slaves and are enduring the brutal cruelties of American slavery, the American South, the story that a redemption is about to happen, and that there is a God who stands with the weak and the oppressed and the persecuted and is about to overturn the powerful and the privileged to bring redemption, that story is very, very important. That's a very important story. And it gives us the power to endure this terrible suffering because it's the only thing that we can count on to hope. Otherwise, we are completely powerless in the circumstance. The Joseph story, I think, is written for a different set of circumstances. The Joseph story is written for people who have some power, who have some political efficacy, who have some control over the conditions of their existence, and are trying to navigate it. And the way ahead isn't so clear. The way ahead is so difficult. And the question is, should we wait for God to come and tell us what to do? Or should we, or is there some way to sort of read these circumstances and, using our own judgment and intelligence, figure out a way? Can I still have faith that even though I'm making decisions without full information, that somehow the circumstance will come out right? And as long as I put myself in the story, and as I put myself in the story, I don't know what comes next. I don't know where this is going, but I just want to believe that somehow it has a teleology, that somehow it's going towards something, maybe benign, at least it's going towards something. It's going towards something. So that's how I think that each of the models is useful for different set of human circumstances. And Sherry's position that it portrays a mercurial God, I think, is very true, because it's a very strange kind of, it's not nearly the narrative you would expect to find. The Moses narrative in a certain way makes a certain logical sense. I want a God who's ruling the world, so go ahead, rule the world. This story is like, really? You're going to make use of people's evil? It's a theory of history. It's a very theory of history. I did this once before. I'll just finish. Once before is that, it seems to me that what the theory of history is here, that if you think you're down, you're really about to go up. And if you think you're up, you're really about to go down, right? And it goes something like this. I'll do it quickly. You say, oh my God, poor Joseph, picked on by his brothers, castigated by his brothers, excluded by his brothers. That's terrible. He said, oh, no, that's wonderful, because that's how he's going to get out there, and they're going to throw him into a pit. Oh, that's horrible. They throw him in. No, that's how he's going to end up in Egypt. He's going to end up in Egypt. That's really terrible. No, you'll see. That's wonderful, because that's how he's going to become the prime minister of Egypt. So, oh, prime minister of Egypt, that's wonderful. No, that's terrible. And you go up and down that way through the whole story. And everything that looks like a boon, like a gift, turns out to be something terrible. And everything that looks like a curse turns out to be the prelude to something remarkable. Even from the very beginning, as we read, he has this dream about the brothers bowing down to him. All of their sheaves bow down to him. The sun, the moon, and the stars bow down. And he thinks that's a glory, but later it's going to become a curse, because he doesn't want bowing down. He wants familiar connection. He wants filial loyalty. He wants a brother. He doesn't want another subject. It's so interesting the way everything gets turned upside down. Sherry, go ahead, please.
I just was entranced, because I'm so taken with that. And it leads exactly to what I wanted to say to you, which is that our first experience with the Moses story is this God that's going to intervene. And I don't know about you, but when I teach it, people are like, I have no connection to that God. I don't get it, whatever. And then at some point we're exposed to this Joseph story, and it's so real. It's so human. God is so removed. It feels tangible. And so I think it's very interesting, because I think it opens people's eyes up to that God may not be just speaking to you through a burning bush. And so you just can dismiss it with no regard, right? You can just say, I'm not going to deal with God because God's not showing up to any bushes at my house, and that's the end of it, right? That Joseph story forces you to contend with, what is theology? What does it mean to have a God interacting in my life and not interacting?
Is there a teleology? Is there a process at work? Look, like you, I'm addicted to the news every day. Read a bunch of newspapers and watch the news and listen to the news, and you wonder, like, is this going anywhere? Is this a process? Well, how will this be read years from now is the question. The Joseph story says, just like dreams are somewhat obscure, but might reveal something about what's happening and who we are, history is obscure and reveals something where we are. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so I want to add a second point to the supremacy of the Joseph story and a world in which God doesn't speak to us directly. And that is not just that, as I said before, in a world where God does not speak to us, we have the full use of our freedom of the will, which is our most distinctive and important gift from God. But secondly, as a history, you asked the teleology, this is the teleology of Galut, of the Jewish people in diaspora, and the brilliance of political powerlessness as a survival technique. Political powerlessness as a survival technique is that when you are politically powerless, no one wants to kill you, wants to overcome you, wants to conquer you. You have no land, you have no armies. You are able to move without power through all the centers of power in the ancient and medieval world. And that ultimately leads to the Dutch East India Company, which the Jewish financiers helped to direct and develop, and the resettlement in America and the New Land. All of that was the result of political powerlessness. Now, my teacher, Richard Rubinstein, who agreed with all this, said, look, that's all true, Mark, but in the end, there's the Holocaust. And the Holocaust shows that even a politically powerless people can be attacked and exterminated. And Israel is the answer to that, but I can't accept that. Therefore, I don't believe in God. That's sort of Rubinstein's move. But I don't want to get bogged down into, does political powerlessness work forever, or is the Holocaust a refutation of it? That's way beyond what we need to do today. What I just want to establish, and the Joseph story establishes it, is that for 2,000 years, the technique for Jewish survival was to be politically powerless.
Right. It was a political, and it worked for those circumstances. I mean, here you get, then it was Herzl who comes along and says, look, modernity has changed the rules of the game, and powerlessness no longer becomes us. And the other critique of Galut, which is that powerlessness has an internal, it's an internal poison to the Jewish people. It didn't, and in the end, it wasn't serving the internal needs of the Jewish culture. That was Ahad Ha'am's great point, that something had happened to us internally. So it's a very interesting, so I'm asking you to take a look at the story and ask the sort of meta question of the story. What is the story here to teach us? Who tells this story? Under what circumstances? And why is the story significant? And why is it that of all the stories that could have been chosen, this is the story that's told to end the book of Genesis? You think now of the narrative arc of Genesis. Think about this as, you begin with, even if you just begin with Abraham, and the way in which Abraham and God relate, and the way Abraham acts as a historical actor, as opposed to the way that Joseph acts as a historical actor. I'd like to turn the conversation now to something somewhat different. And it's a very interesting question for this moment in our history. And it has to do with how we experience the Joseph story. Now, I have it on very good authority that when Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, the Andrew Lloyd Webber play, came to Broadway, Sherry Hirsch, then Sherry Zwelling, was in the play. Is this true? Is this true?
It's not the Broadway edition. It is the Congregation near Tamid with Rabbi Schulman as the rabbi, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade edition.
Close enough. Close enough.
I played the narrator. So let's just be clear. It's a little distance between Broadway and Congregation near Tamid in Pelican.
I was going to ask you to sing the score for us.
Oh, don't worry. I'll save you from that.
But I want to, this is important, because here's the question. So generation of young Jews have experienced this story as they've experienced no other Bible story, because so many were in the play, or so many watched the play, or so many have been part of the production of the play. How does that change the way that a new generation reads the story, Cher?
Well, I feel like Joseph, everybody says that Hamilton is the greatest thing ever. And I do believe that. It's incredible, right? We have kids talking about Hamilton, but I think Joseph was the precursor to that. That, knowing that story, putting it on as a play, laughing and singing and dancing our way through it from 4th to 6th grade was a very pivotal moment for me. It's the story I know best. I mean, yes, I've gone to rabbinical school and everything, but I have that in my kishkas, right? I sang, I danced, I did the whole thing. And I'm not even that kind of person that would sing and dance in front of people. So I think what's really interesting is I think it's about how do we take these stories and make them our own, and how do they get interpreted in modern culture, and how do they become their own, have their own life in modern culture?
As mass culture how do the arts and how does media culture become an interpretive tool for something as sacred as, on one hand, biblical stories? And what happens when a generation experiences these stories through that? And then on the other hand, say American history through the story of Hamilton. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. So my theory is that that this is based on the Gelman first principle. Gelman's first principle is if it's popular, it's bad. That's just my basic view of life. But what I mean about popular culture, to answer directly your question, is that popular culture, when it does take cognizance of Jewish history or biblical stories or the Jewish people in some way, it completely perverts and distorts it. And the example I offer is Josephine Technicolor Dreamcoat, which, by the way, we put on in our synagogue, Temple Beth Torah, and all the kids loved it. And I was sitting there as the narrator as well. And they all loved it. It's fine. And Fiddler on the Roof. In both those, you could argue, are the two most dramatic, most popular, most iconic treatments of Judaism and Jews by popular culture. In neither one of them, I could be wrong about this, be the first time, but it could happen. I don't think the word Jew, Jewish, Judaism, any of those words occur even once in Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's a guy, Joseph, and his brother. Of course, it's a biblical setting, but there's no word Jew. Just like, and this is unbelievable, in Fiddler on the Roof, I don't think the word Jew is used. I could be wrong on that too. And they don't use actual Jewish music, they use created music that sounds Jewish. And it's like, it's sort of like the Saturday Night Live Myers bit on where he's a Jewish lady and he says, I'm all for Clement. There's an entire, now several generations of Jews who think verklempt is an actual Yiddish word, which it isn't. It's a made up word. So popular culture, when it touches anything, it perverts it, destroys it, trivializes it, and we, thank God, were free of being dealt with by popular culture. But when they did, they de-Judaized it.
Whoa, Gelman, you're such an elitist, for God's sakes.
Hey.
I'm going to argue on two levels. First of all, I'm going to say that maybe. I'm going to argue, first of all, that it is inevitable that popular culture will take forms and stories, narratives and images from sacred culture and turn them into popular culture. That's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's happened. Look, I hate to say this, Gelman, but in our generation, it was the movie The Ten Commandments. And we all grew up with this image of Moses as Charlton Heston. Okay. And then in previous generations, you had all kinds of folkloric images, folkloric tellings of rabbinic stories, folkloric tellings of traditional stories from the Bible. We've always done this. I mean, we Jews have always done this. Culture has always done this. But the second point is, yes, it's true that it can make it base and banal and boring and foolish. That's possible. But then think of something else for a moment. Think of Schindler's List. Schindler's List is a form of popular culture which took a sacred narrative, the sacred narrative of the Holocaust. And more people saw Schindler's List than ever read all of the Holocaust literature that was ever produced, including the Diary of Anne Frank. More people were exposed to the brutality of Nazis and the possibilities of Christian rescuers through Schindler's List than all the books were ever written. And in that sense, it added something to our experience as Jews and to our place in American and Western culture. So I wouldn't dismiss it altogether.
I don't. In fact, I would say Schindler's List is a beautiful example of the alternative, but it's done by a Jewish genius. Spielberg's work was a work of genius. Schindler's List is a work of genius, and it wasn't de-Judaized. There was, however, because it's popular culture, and you know and you remember when it came out, there was a criticism of Schindler's List, and the criticism was Holocaust light, that it showed the Holocaust and it showed certain instances of brutality, very graphic, but not as graphic as the Holocaust deserved. And that's the critique that came that said, look, you think what he showed you was bad? Let me explain what was really bad.
Right. It had a happy ending, which is an American way of telling stories. But on the other hand, it offered a
But it
moral...
did have a happy ending in that way. The Schindler Juden are the only kind of nechemta you can get out of the Holocaust.
Right. Right. Which is, and then that's an interesting question in itself. So I'm just suggesting that you don't dismiss all of these expressions of popular culture.
I was just going to say the Grinch is back, Eddie. We thought we got him at the end of last week, but no, he's back and he's well.
No.
And I also push back on you, Mark, that the word Jew and Judaism as being the litmus test, if it's authentic, is really thin. I mean, we don't even develop that word till much later. And it derives from Judah. I think there is so much to this peoplehood. I mean, that is not the litmus test for me. And we can disagree about that. The other thing I would say is you, of all people who are a master of Midrash, is a person that I would imagine would embrace all the ways that we make interpretations of this sacred text. And so to me, it's even more shocking because you're the master of interpretation. And so the fact that we would interpret not just through words, but through art and culture and science and mathematics. I mean, my son wrote me an interpretation of a biblical story in mathematic formulas. Like that to me adds to the tradition, right?
Yes, because Midrash is from the tradition, grounded in the tradition, and has the faith of the tradition. I'll give you just one example of why today it's really more like anger, because this de-Judaizing, look, the thing about Hanukkah is the thing about Hanukkah, but the point is, what we have here is the de-Judaizing of all things Jewish when they hit popular culture. And the final example I'll bring is the proliferation of Holocaust museums and Holocaust institutes in different cities all around the country. Some of them receive federal funding, some local funding. And there was one near our synagogue, and they in a community, and they built it, and you go there and they have school kids come there for lessons about the Holocaust. And I was there for one of these lessons, and their lesson, they said, you know, when someone bullies someone, well, that's what the Holocaust was about. It's about bullying. Now, I was ready to just explode. Now, I understand they had to find a way to build a publicly funded Holocaust center and make it work. But the only way they could make it work was by taking the Jewish nature of the Holocaust out of it and making it a universal event. This all goes back to the fight between Wiesenthal and Wiesel about whether we should light 6 candles or 11 candles to commemorate the Holocaust, because 11 million people were killed in the camps with 6 million Jews. So I'm telling you, there is a tremendous, tremendous danger. You can't talk about Jewish life in Eastern Europe in a musical on Fiddler on the Roof and not once say Jew. I'm sorry, you can't do it. But they did it. And you can't talk about Joseph as a biblical character saying he was a Jewish guy and never say the word Jew. I really worry about the effect of popular culture. And frankly, in terms of being surprised, I'm surprised that all of you are just sucking up to popular culture, because I don't think it brings us any great chiddush as Jews. I don't think it brings us any closer to God. Popular culture is popular culture. That's why they call it that. In fact, it's a contradiction in terms, popular culture.
And yet, Mark, how many rabbis played the narrator in Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat? I don't have that data.
They had a gun. They had a gun. They threatened me. They forced me to be.
But let me just say, I can't imagine there's not a correlation between the people that got something from these experiential moments of internalizing in a modern way these stories that led them to lead powerful Jewish lives. I mean, I don't have the data on that. Please, no one quote me. But I just want to know, Eddie, were you in the play?
We produced it at camp one winter. I was the director of a winter camp at Ramon. We produced it. So yeah.
So yes, you were in the play.
I wasn't in it. I was one of the,
you were at the back, whatever they call it.
As a schlepper is what I was.
No, that's not the schlepper. The back is always the most important. That's
no, but I appreciate Rabbi Gelman's critique of modern culture. And I also appreciate the fact that, 40 years ago that Gilda Radner, Allah Shalom, lit Hanukkah candles at the end of Saturday Night Live. And I sat there with Nina and some friends. We were I think living in New York at the time, saying, the 280 million Americans have never seen this before. They've never seen a Jewish family light Hanukkah candles, and then Adam Sandler's song comes through, and
absolutely, that was a great moment in popular.
Right. And I had my own experience, Mark. I have to tell you that as a rabbi here in Southern California in LA, there was a local Baptist high school, fundamentalist Baptist high school, that produced Fiddler on the Roof as their high school play. And the director called me and asked me to come and speak to the kids. And I spent like hours with these kids. They had never sat with anybody Jewish before and really talked about who we are, what our beliefs are. Started out with tell us about the story of Tevye and Goldie and his daughters. And then it ended up in a much deeper conversation about pluralism of religion in America and what it means to be a Christian and a Jew. It was a remarkable experience. And it was remarkable to see this kids produce this play with a great deal of sensitivity and reverence for things Jewish.
And
Sherry, you get the last word, and we're going to call it a morning. Go ahead.
You mentioned Radner. You mentioned Adam Sandler. 2 days ago, Daveed Diggs, African-American Jewish rapper, releases with the Walt Disney Company, not a small little producer, the Walt Disney Company, A Puppy for Hanukkah, says the full blessings within the music, and within like 48 hours, it's over 45,000 views. So,
Gelman, whether you like it or not, popular culture has become an interpreter of tradition and a vehicle for conveying Jewish forms and Jewish tradition, Jewish ideas, not just to the world, but also to our own children. And we're going to have to live with it, whether you like it or not. I want to wish everybody a very, very good Hanukkah and a very, very good Shabbos. I want to remind you that following our Torah study this morning, you're welcome to join us here online for Valley Beth Shalom's morning service. As well, you're welcome to join us for the Neshama Minyan, a beautiful spiritual musical minyan led by Nina Bieber Feinstein, who's very close to me, and Cindy Paley Abudi. They'll be leading the Neshama this morning. This morning, live from the synagogue, is the bat mitzvah of Leland Schildenheim, who's celebrating her bat mitzvah this morning, Shabbos Hanukkah, as well as the Neshama Minyan. You'll find them both on Facebook and on YouTube. And here on the VBS website, you can find the links to them as well. This evening, Havdalah, and candle lighting tonight at 6 o'clock. All week we're doing Hanukkah stuff, so please look for us. There's a Grinch story coming as well for the children, edible menorah contests coming, and a concert tonight that Cantor Barron is leading from the Nefesh
Such
Mountain.
fun stuff, Eddie. I just have to
All
tell
wonderful.
you, I love as a member, just like getting all this stuff. I'm so excited to participate.
Gelman, you're going to love this. It's a country western Jewish band from New York. Talk about popular culture. So to everyone listening,
Friedman was terrific.
A very
Ride him, Jew boy. Ride him.
A very sweet happy Hanukkah to everyone.
Happy Hanukkah.
Shabbat shalom.